Welcome to Unit 3, Art as Cultural Heritage, Lesson 18, Traditional Arts of Asia. In order to understand and appreciate the art and architecture of the world, we need to be familiar with the cultures of the world. Traditional Arts of Asia introduces the readers to the religions and cultures of the Far East. Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Shinto are discussed in the chapter. More along in the lesson we'll be going over mostly Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, but make sure that you read. Also, along with the resulting art and architecture in the countries of India, China, and Japan. Also, Japan is mostly only covered in your text. The objectives for this lesson are to list and explain the basic belief systems of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, name and compare the art and architecture associated with India and China, name artistic representations and iconography of Buddhism and Hinduism. The topics we'll be covering in this lesson are India, Buddhist art, Hindu art, Southeast Asia, and China.
Within the traditional arts of Asia, we will start with India. This is a limestone sculpture of a male torso from the ancient city of Harappa in the Indus Valley from around 2400 to 2000 BCE. The Indus Valley is where Indian culture began. Most of what was once the Indus Valley is now located in modern-day Pakistan. The styling of this figure is very naturalistic, which was not as typical with Egyptian sculpture that was going on at the same time. The ancient Indians had a much better grasp of what the human form looked like. The fleshy look of the sculpture appeals to the erotic and sensual side of Indian art. This is a historical map of Asia. It covers all of the locations that'll be in this lesson. If you look at the upper middle on the left-hand side, we see Harappa, which is where the male torso was found. We're now going to move down to Sanchi to talk about the Great Stupa. I just mentioned the Great Stupa. A stupa is one of the earliest forms of Buddhist architecture. Before we get into the stupa, we'll talk a little bit about Buddhism. Buddhism began when Siddhartha Gautama achieved enlightenment while seeking the answer to human suffering. When he was seeking the answer to human suffering, he arrived at what is called the Four Noble Truths. The first of which is existence is full of suffering. Second, the cause of suffering is desire. Third, to eliminate suffering, one must eliminate desire. And fourth, to eliminate desire, one must follow the eightfold path of right views, right aspirations, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right contemplation. In Buddhism, it is believed that there is an endless cycle of death and rebirth. Enlightenment is when one breaks that cycle. Siddhartha was eventually given the name Buddha, which means the enlightened one. This is the Great Stupa from Sanchi, India, built between 10 BCE and 15 CE. A stupa is a symbolic place. Originally, relics from religious figures were buried within. The dome-like structure is a symbol of a mountain which represents the world. To walk around the entire structure is the walk of life around the world mountain. There are 4 entrance gateways to the stupa, and we'll be looking at one of them next. This is the eastern gate of the Great Stupa. If you look at it closely, there are relief sculptures all over it. These sculptures depict stories from Buddha's life. They are on all of the gates. Even though the gates tell the stories of Buddha's life, he is never physically represented in these narrations of his life. This is a diagram of the evolution of Buddhist architecture. On the far left, we have the early Indian stupa, which we just saw an example of with the Great Stupa. These were being constructed between the 3rd century to the early 1st century BCE. Next to the early Indian stupa, we have the later Indian stupa, which was made up to the 2nd century CE. Next to that, we have the Chinese pagoda, which was made between the 5th and 7th centuries. And next to that, we have the Japanese pagoda, which was being made in the 7th century CE. In the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great had conquered several areas in West Asia, including the Gandhara region where this sculpture is from. This caused a fusion between styles of the Romans. The Romans certainly let people continue with their certain stylistic traits, but here this resembles the Roman influence on the sculpture of the time. This sculpture is of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a person who is on the point of achieving enlightenment. This sculpture is of a standing Buddha. It's from the 5th century. This Buddha sculpture is made in the Gupta style, which combines the early Indian stylings with the naturalism of the Gandhara style that we just looked at. The Buddha is dressed in monk's clothing, and the bun, or top knot, on the top of his head symbolizes his enlightenment. The disc-like shape behind the figure is also symbolic of the cyclical nature of life. This is a detail of a fresco painting from the Ajanta caves in India from around 600 to 650. It is of the beautiful Bodhisattva Padmapani. This is painted in the Gupta style. The Gupta style became synonymous with Buddhist paintings, and when Buddhism eventually spread to China, this style spread and became typical of Chinese painting. Our next subject is Hindu art. Hinduism recognizes 3 principal gods: Brahma, who is the creator of all things; Vishnu, who is the sustainer; and Shiva is the destroyer. Most of you have probably seen an image of Shiva before. It is an angry god with 4 arms and 2 legs. This is the exterior of a structure called the Khandarya Mahadeva Temple. It was built between the 10th and 11th centuries. This is typical of the Hindu temple design. The Hindu temple design usually contains 2 portions: a porch, which is for the preparation and purification of the entering worshipper, and another portion called the womb chamber, which is called the Garbha Griha. It is a sacred room where the image of the god is kept. The rounded protruding forms up on top represent male and female sexuality, and you can't see them very well in this, but it's also surrounded by hundreds of erotic sculptures. This is an example of one of the erotic reliefs on the outside wall of the Khandarya Mahadeva temple. In Hindu art, God is equivocated with erotic love, so in a sense, the closer you get to erotic love, the closer you get to God. If you look at the design of the figures, it follows the design that was in the male torso from the ancient city of Harappa that we looked at a little while back. Another aspect that was unique to Hindu culture is the fact that the male and female figures are both enjoying erotic love. It's not just limited to the male pleasure, which is typical in other parts of the world. This is a bronze sculpture from South India. It is Nataraja, Shiva as the king of dance, from the Kola period, from the 11th century. Hindu art also delved into the cyclical nature of life, that life was a constant flux of creation, preservation, destruction, and recreation of the universe. The little wispy-like pieces on the outer edges of the circle are representative of fire, which represents destruction and creation. In his hand on the upper right, he has a small finger drum. The tapping of the small drum is to mark the cosmic rhythm of death and rebirth. Eventually, India was conquered by invading Islamic Mughal rulers in the early 16th century. As with the Indian style taking on Roman characteristics, they also start to take on the characteristics of the invading cultures. This merging of styles led to something we see in here called the Basholi style. This painting is the approach of Krishna from around 1660 to 1670. This painting also has traditional elements of erotic love and spiritual longing. We are now moving to Southeast Asia to look at the art and architecture of Indonesia and Cambodia. This is the Buddhist temple Borobudur. It is in Java, Indonesia, built around the year 800. If you look at the center, there's a strong similarity to the older Indian stupa design, but it's massively elaborated upon. If you look surrounding in the circular designs, there are smaller little stupa-like structures. And then to the outside of that, you have over 10 miles of walls with relief sculptures on them. This is a photo of the first gallery, one of the corridors at Borobudur. In a cyclical pattern, these corridors have relief sculptures that are telling the stories of the journey to enlightenment. Also, on the lower levels, you have reliefs that are dealing with the struggle of existence and the cycle of death and rebirth. There are also some relief sculptures of the life of Buddha, and as pilgrims walk through these corridors, they get the cyclical sense of life by continuously passing through on a journey. This is the Cambodian temple Angkor Wat. It is the west entrance. It was built near the capital of the Khmer Empire from around 1120 to 1150. At Angkor Wat, there are symbols of Buddhism and Hinduism. There are sculptures that are side by side of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Hindu gods, meaning that the people at this time considered that both religions were compatible. This diagram is a plan for Angkor Wat. Besides having sculptures of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Hindu gods side by side, there was mostly representations of Vishnu inside Angkor Wat. Vishnu, remember, is the sustainer of all life. So the symbolism of Angkor Wat leans towards fertility. The little buddy-like structures on top are representative of flower buds. We will be finishing up our lesson on the traditional arts of Asia by going over some of the art of China. China gets its name from the first Emperor Qin. What is in this slide is a cross-section of just some of 6,000 terracotta warriors that were buried in the tomb of Emperor Qin. This army of clay was made and buried with Emperor Qin to protect him in the afterlife. This tomb was untouched until it was discovered in 1974.
The last belief system we'll be covering for this lesson is Taoism. In Taoism, life is one of harmony with the force that animates all created beings. Qi is the life force. It's the vibrant spirit that animates all things. We won't really be covering any images in this particular PowerPoint lesson having to do with Taoism, but please make sure to read over it in your text. We are now done with our lesson on the traditional arts of Asia. Thank you for listening.